Hello and welcome to my talk on how to start your PhD. My name is John Measy and over the next half hour I'm going to be talking to you about what I think are the most important aspects for you to be thinking about at the start of your PhD. So let's get started. So I think the first thing that you have to think about is, why are you doing a PhD? Here's a bunch of reasons that people have given me in the past about why they're doing a PhD that I think are all not good reasons. Writing a thesis because they want to pass a PhD, but not what they want to do with it. To please their advisor, not a good reason to do a PhD or to write a thesis. And to fill in time while they decide what to do with their lives. So, although these are all reasons why PhD people have done PhDs in the past, these are not really good reasons for starting a PhD, and you should be digging deeper into why you want to do a PhD and how that's actually going to help you. Because one thing that's been very clear to me in the past when I've been supervising many PhD students is that in order to do a PhD well, you have to own it. It has to be your study. You have to want to do it for yourself. You have to be interested in it. It's something that you have to want to do. So you have to own your own research project. So it's the first thing, extremely important. And then the second thing is that you're not writing a thesis in order to pass your PhD. You're not writing it to please your advisor, and you're not doing it just to fill in time. You're writing because you need to communicate the research project that you own to an audience. Now, initially, when you write that PhD, it's going to be an audience of examiners, but eventually, hopefully, you'll get to publish all the chapters of your PhD, and that will be an audience of scientists and potentially a much greater audience of people around as well. So once you know why you want to publish your PhD, or once you know why you want to write your PhD, the next phase is to plan the chapters that are going to be in it and think about the contents of your PhD. So what questions are you going to ask? What study system are you going to use? What techniques, what ideas do you have? The hypotheses. All these things are going to be swirling around in your mind at the beginning of your PhD, and you're going to need to commit them to paper at some point. So I suggest that you start by writing them all down. If you can do a mind map or some kind of graphical information, if that suits you and the way you think, that's really great, because what we need to do is move from all of these ideas and hypotheses and questions and all of the ideas that you have already. We need to move those into a formal plan for each chapter of your thesis. So a thesis will typically have 5 chapters. It's going to be read in a linear fashion, but that's not necessarily how it's actually going to work. At the heart of each chapter is going to be a question. Should be a hypothesis, but it might not be. You may have one chapter that, for example, that's a technique, and then in the following chapters you actually try out that technique. So try to be open with your thesis plan. Discuss it with your advisor. Map it out on a piece of paper. But it probably won't be something very simple and linear like this one that you see here, because if you're going to have a technique as one of your chapters, you're probably going to use it not only in chapter 4, but is also in chapter 3 and potentially in chapter 5 as well. So a technique that you're going to use again and again in your thesis. Question 1, maybe you need to answer question 1 before you can ask question 3. Likewise, you might need to answer question 3 before you can answer question 5. And there may be some connectedness between questions 4 and 5 as well. So your PhD is likely to have a whole load of interconnectedness between chapters and skipping around, and it's a really great idea if you can conceptualize this together with the obligatory introduction and conclusion chapters before you start writing, or right at the start of planning your PhD, because it's really going to help you work out what you need to know while you're doing the planning. It's going to be an interconnected thesis, and in fact, the way that a lot of PhDs are examined means that your PhD is not simply 5 chapters that are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that could all be published as standalone papers, but the rules and regulations about accepting a PhD thesis means that it must actually add up to be more than simply a sum of the parts. So you can't just have 5 papers, put them together and call it a PhD. Okay? Your PhD must be conceptually something greater. So it's definitely going to have this interconnectedness right from the outset, and you're going to have to plan for that. And then once you've got this conceptual plan and you and your advisor agree on it, keep it. It's going to be a figure in the introduction of your thesis. That's that very first chapter at the top there. And you're going to be able to use this not only as a reference guide for your own explanation to yourself and anyone else that you propose your thesis to, but you're going to be able to use this to explain to your examiners the layout of your PhD and how the chapters relate to each other. It's actually really useful thing, not just for you, but also for your examiners. So once you know how your thesis is connected and what the conceptual, once you've conceived it, you're going to need to plan your time of when you're actually going to do it. So here's a very simple Gantt type diagram. In it you see 4 quarters in each of the 3 years, and 3 is typical for many PhDs these days. Whether it's right or wrong, we won't go into here, but you can see that the first year and 1 quarter is spent on chapter 1 and the technique 1, and then chapters 3, 4 and 5 follow on very quickly after that, very rapidly. Very, very unlikely, and indeed if you're in the biological sciences, what you're much more likely to do is have some kind of seasonal quotient that constrains the work that you're doing. So in this case, I've used quarter 2 here to emphasize the need that 4 of the chapters have to have sampling going on in the 2nd quarter of each year. And you can see that as soon as you make that a requirement, your life gets a lot more complicated. So however your time is planned, you will need to be multitasking on several projects at once. And when I talk about several projects, I mean several chapters of your thesis. So planning is key, and you've got to know what and who you need before you start, especially in those busy periods. So especially if your sampling is seasonal and you've got to dedicate some out of every year to that seasonal sampling, you've got to be set up right from the beginning. You've got to know what equipment you're going to need for those times and what personnel potentially you're going to need as well if you can't do it all on your own. So plan ahead. This timeline again is extremely useful for you. Perhaps it will be a lot more detailed. So for example, maybe you want to go to a conference and you want to present your technique. Maybe you want to go to the same conference again in the 3rd year and present chapter 1. Knowing when those conferences are that you want to attend and putting them into this kind of Gantt type diagram is very useful right from the beginning, so you know you've got some goals to aim for. And talking of goals, put those goals in there as well. So say that by the end of the third quarter of the first year, you want to have finished the sampling and the first set of analysis for question 1, chapter 1. The fact that you're going to add in the second and third year of sampling, that's all that's needed for that chapter. And in fact, once you've written the code for chapter 1, you can simply collect the data later on, and you should just be able to write it up reasonably quickly because you've already done the analysis that you plan to do at the end of the first season. So we have added in the second season, and the third season is just going to be added data. So I would also suggest that you share these goals so that not only you know when you're supposed to be doing things, but your advisor also knows when to expect these milestones in your PhD period. You've also got to be realistic, so you also got to not plan to do too much or not think that you're going to complete a whole chapter in 2 weeks. Give yourself some slack, build contingency planning in if you can. So perhaps each of these chapters only needs 2 spring seasons in order to complete them. Build in a third because it might fail 1 year and you might not be able to do it. So building contingency planning if you can in your thesis. Think ahead, basically. So the next suggestion I have for you at the start of your thesis is to be led by the literature. Now, I hope that all of you are familiar with the logo on Google Scholar there, which says "Stand on the Shoulders of Giants," because this is at the heart of what we do in the sciences, is that we don't try and formulate everything from basics, but we look to see what has already been done in the literature first. So be led by the literature, build your research on solid foundations. Now that doesn't mean that you can read anything and necessarily believe that that's the way that it should be or must be. So read critically and cite carefully. Okay, be very careful with your reading. Read methods carefully. Do you approve of the way that they have measured things? And don't just take what is published as necessarily being the best thing. And especially, I would underline that for journals that you might have some esteem for. Try to be realistic in the fact that getting into those journals is not necessarily because you produce a piece of quality science. It can be, but there is certainly quality science all over the literature, and there's also some very poor science too. So read critically and only use citations where they're relevant to be used. And then the other thing is that you will do a lot of reading at the start of your PhD. You'll hopefully put together a literature review of pertinent literature, but you need to keep that reading. So you need to maintain a literature database. You need to have some alerts on your favorite citation database, and you need to keep reading. Make your lists of questions, variables, methods, mechanisms. Keep that going throughout your PhD process, because you're going to have to stay current and up to date with all the literature as you go through. And then I would also suggest that you write from the start. So you start writing down notes, try and actually write full sentences, write about the literature that you read, because as writers or somebody who will have to write a thesis, the more practice you can get in right from the beginning, the better and the easier it will be towards the end. So don't put off writing until you've finished all of your experiments and you've got all your data from all your chapters. Start writing from the beginning, and I think writing a literature review of pertinent literature is a great way to start. Writing about the literature you read is also a really good way of remembering what is in there. So yeah, write from the start. So you can also practice writing by reviewing literature that you read. So you can write mock reviews. You can review your friends' manuscripts in a kind of semi-formal way where you write a review of them. You can review preprints that are already on the internet and post those reviews. There's lots of different ways in which you can practice your writing and combine that with reading of literature for your thesis. Okay, I have written this book about how to write a PhD, and I want to tell you that the chapters on how to write are the most numerous in the book. There's probably, I think there's more than 20 of them. So you've got a chapter about how to get started writing, how to write a hypothesis, being aware that you can get it wrong, what happens if you don't have a hypothesis, what's the big idea, writing a paragraph, can AI write my PhD, construct a logical argument in your writing, etc. So there's lots and lots of chapters. I'm not going to go through them all there, but I have selected just a few of those to introduce now, mostly because I think they're important when you are starting to write your PhD. So first of all, there's a chapter about what's the big idea. So as I mentioned earlier, your PhD should be greater than a sum of the parts. And the best way to pull all those parts together is to have an overarching hypothesis, question, theory that you're trying to test throughout your PhD. Perhaps in different ways, using different systems, or perhaps using different types of experiment on the same system. But your thesis should try to come together under the umbrella of a bigger theory or a bigger hypothesis. So how do you find that right big idea? The first thing is to look in the literature surrounding your subject area to find those big questions. Many subject areas have review papers on big questions in their disciplines. Try to keep your searches relatively current. These things are revised on a sort of 5 or decadal basis. So maybe don't go back too far, but many of the old theories, of course, are still relevant, and many theses are still being written based on ideas that Darwin, for example, came up with. So don't be worried about old ideas, but make sure that you have taken reasonably recent reviews of what those ideas are and what the pertinent ways they're being tested. So you need to dig into these review papers and decide which of these bigger ideas fit well into your particular topic. And one way of doing these has been written up by Hager and Jeschke, which is the hierarchy of hypotheses, which is shown on the right-hand side here. So it's a way of taking all the hypotheses that you have noted about your subject area or you think may be relevant, and then structuring those and putting them down, those that are more evidence-based, those more theory-based, organizing them for you and your subject area to decide which are most relevant and which is the umbrella idea that most of your research fits under. So the next thing you'll need to do is turn the questions that you have into hypotheses. Now, this is a point that a lot of students find particularly difficult, and so there's a chapter on how to write a hypothesis in the book. And let's remember that this sort of way, this hypothetical way of asking questions in science means that you have to be able to pose a hypothesis that can be refuted. So a hypothesis is then a falsifiable statement of your research intent. And as I said, there's a chapter all about how to do this, but basically most people are quite comfortable with making predictions, and a prediction is if this, then that. Most people are quite comfortable with this, and most students who come to make hypotheses actually tend to make predictions instead of hypotheses. And the difference is that they're missing the mechanism. So your hypothesis needs not only to have this prediction, but it has to have the prediction in the case of the hypothesis. So if, then, because. So you have to be able to test a particular causal agent in order to turn your prediction into a hypothesis. So basically, you have your independent variable is your if, your dependent variables, these are the things that you measure, they're the then, and then your mechanism is the because. So think very carefully. The mechanism is perhaps one of the most difficult things to get right when you're posing your hypothesis, because obviously this is the part of your experiment that you need to be able to control. Because you need to, in biological sciences especially, there can be many potential mechanisms at play, and so your prediction may not necessarily hinge on the mechanism that you think it does. So be very careful in the way that you pose your hypotheses, but of course you also have your advisor and your peer group to discuss these things with, possibly a committee as well. So my next suggestion is that, having put together this literature review, you spent a long time reading and writing, and you develop these hypotheses, you understand now, perhaps more than anyone else about your particular subject area, that you actually save this together with your chosen design methodology, which is basically your PhD proposal, and you register it. So at the point where you've done your literature review, you've decided what experiments you're going to do, you've designed the methodology, and you're ready to do everything, this is a large sort of threshold for most PhD students. If you're working with animals, for example, then you will need to do an ethics assessment at this point. So you'll need to hand in your proposal to an ethics committee. So I would suggest that you also take it and you review it. You have it reviewed, obviously by your advisor, but perhaps also by a larger committee or peer group, and then you register it at a pre-registration site. So it's a public registration document that when you come back to publishing, you can actually show your peer reviewers, you can demonstrate that no, you lodged this particular design methodology, way of analyzing the data, the question that you were going to ask, it's always been the same. You are not hypothesizing after the results are known. So avoid harking. Science has got in quite a difficult situation around constantly having positive results or constantly accepting the alternative hypotheses, because this is the sort of culture that has emerged in science, but it's really not good. We need to start being much more transparent as scientists, and so I advise that wherever you can, you pre-register your plans and have them available to show to reviewers, to show to journal editors, because in the future, this kind of pre-registration of research plans is going to become more and more important, so that we can be transparent as scientists. We can register ideas and make sure that everyone is aware we're not hypothesizing after the results are known, we're not harking. Okay, so I have throughout this particular book placed an emphasis on having hypotheses, because hypotheses sit at the heart of each of your chapters. So basically all of your introduction is in order for you to introduce what your hypothesis is to the reader. Okay, so you give the overview of the major theme, you introduce the important variables that you're going to consider, you introduce the organism or the system that you're studying, you identify the problem, and then you clearly state the aim or hypothesis that this particular chapter has. Okay, so the hypothesis is sitting really at the heart of the whole thing. The methods and materials, these are just done in order to describe how you measure and test your hypotheses. You give the results, and then the discussion is you responding to the hypotheses that you gave in the introduction. Okay, and then some discussion on it. So the hypothesis is super important, because getting that right and getting that right at the beginning will mean that writing, the rest of the writing is going to come a lot easier. So you also need to remember that you have a whole network of people. Although this is your PhD, it's your study, you do have lots of people that you can turn to ask. There's your advisor. Hopefully your advisor is available to you as often as you need them. But science has been described as this complex and self-organizing and evolving network of scholars, project papers and ideas. And I really think that's right. So don't just stop at your advisor, but go beyond, ask your peer group, ask your researcher community, and discuss ideas, get input, and use your research network. Because even after you finish your PhD, the more contacts that you make during your PhD, the more options you'll find that you have in the future. So reach out while you're doing your PhD and embrace the network of people who are also massively enthusiastic about doing science. You'll meet some great people. And the last thing I want to talk about today is to keep a check on your mental health. So doing a PhD is a lot of work. There will be a lot of pressure on you, a lot of stresses, and not only will you be doing a PhD, but you also have to live your life at the side of this, and most people's lives are also reasonably complicated these days. So what you should be doing is taking positive steps in order to preserve your mental health. One thing that's very important is to know your support network. So these are people both inside your research community, but perhaps more importantly outside. So know who you can go to talk and discuss problems and ideas with. And look out not just for yourself, but look out for others. So your peer group around you, other people who are doing a PhD, look out for them. Maintain your well-being. So when people start having problems with their mental health, these often manifest themselves first in their relationships with other people. So perhaps somebody you feel they're behaving quite oddly, maybe their exercise regime, maybe they're over-exercising or under-exercising, maybe their nutrition is got very poor, their personal hygiene has declined. All of these are signs that you or somebody near you is having struggles with their mental health. So watch out for these things. They can often be flags. My other suggestion is to take a reference GHQ test. So I've got a general health questionnaire with 12 questions in the book. It takes maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do it. So in your current stage, start of your PhD, I would suggest that you do this general health questionnaire, write down all the answers, put them in a drawer, put them somewhere in a file on the internet, and keep these as a reference point so that if somebody comes to you and says, oh, they think they're very worried about you and they're wondering whether you're always like this and do you have these kind of problems, you can take the test again and you can say to them, look, actually, no, this is me, and I'm just feeling exactly the same as I did at the beginning of my PhD, so this is not a PhD course problem. Or maybe you'll surprise yourself. Maybe you will find that you do need to ask for help, go to your support network, because you've moved 2 or more points on several of these different questions. So there's a chapter about mental health, there's plenty of ideas there, but you need to take some positive steps, and you can do that now when you're feeling fine. Better to do those things now and be aware of these things than wait until it's too late. So don't forget that there's plenty of help out there. I've written this book, it's written for you. It's available as a hard copy, but actually it's also available completely free online. It's open access. It was written in Markdown. It's on GitHub, which means that if you want anything changed, you can simply notify me, or you can do a pull request on GitHub and you can ask for an update. You can tell me that something is wrong. There's very, very likely to be stuff that's in here that's wrong or out of date, needs to be updated. But there are more chapters in this online version than there are in the printed book. So for example, the most recent one is about ChatGPT and Google Bard and whether these can be used to write your PhD for you. There's also a second book. When you come to publishing your chapters, there's a second book with a second website, howtopublishscience.org. And there's also lots of information there about publishing when you need to do it.